The town of Redfern sat crooked in the crook of two ridges, worn thin by dust and regret. Wind ran like a whip through its alleys and empty barns, stirring up prayers in the form of grit. It was not a place folks came to find dreams. Redfern was where dreams crawled off to die. The Dunn sisters stepped off the supply wagon at dusk. Their shoes, mismatched, cracked at the soles, sank in the red dirt. Lorna, the older by 7 minutes, carried the firewood-colored satchel that held their lives in miniature. A thimble, 2 Bible pages, a needle, and a handkerchief their mama stitched before she took sick and left the world in a storm of fever. Bea held her silence, gaze flicking like a startled doe across storefronts and signage faded by sun. She wore her hair plaited in a rope down her back, neat despite the ride, and there was something in the set of her mouth that made folks hesitate to speak first. They were 17 and 23, but the war had aged them sideways. Lorna tightened her grip on the satchel and turned toward the livery, where the man who bought them was said to keep his horses. Neither sister had wanted this, but after their father's debts called in the land, and the sheriff said they'd do well to disappear before a colder fate found them, choice had thinned like broth. The arrangement had been brokered through a preacher in Abilene, a man called Merritt Calder, widower, rancher, no children, no kin. He wanted help on his spread, the letter said, and a quiet house again. He did not ask for 2 wives, only one woman with strong hands and a willing back. But the preacher, sniffing desperation on both ends, saw a fit. So 2 sisters, bound by blood and calamity, were sent in a single crate of fate. The livery barn smelled of hay and horse sweat. Lantern light bled through cracks in the slats, and inside a figure moved, tall, broad at the shoulders, wearing a coat patched too many times to be proud. Merritt Calder turned toward them like he'd heard their bones creak. His face was sun-bitten and bristled, his eyes dark as soot. He looked at them like a man looks at snowfall in April, unexpected, unwanted, but not their fault. "You're both come," he said, not a question. Lorna nodded, dry-throated. Bea said nothing. He stood a beat too long before speaking again. "Name's Merritt. Suppose I owe you a roof." He led them from the barn without asking what they could do, without a single look too long or a word too soft. He didn't speak more than necessary as they rode in the back of his buckboard cart, the wind clawing at their sleeves, the dark sky swallowing the last of day. Calder's land was a sprawl of stone and scrub, the house a 2-story thing with more ghosts than warmth. The porch groaned as if surprised by visitors. Merritt pushed open the door with the ease of someone who lived alone too long, and the air inside smelled like old tobacco and pine ash. He showed them the spare room, just 1 bed, a basin, a cracked mirror, and left them to it. "We weren't supposed to be 2, Lorna said, as the silence closed around them. Bea untied her hair and said, "We weren't supposed to be sold either." They slept in their dresses that night, backs turned, the space between them heavy with all they didn't say. In the days that followed, they learned Merritt rose before the sun and worked until the sky gave up. He didn't call them by name, didn't ask them for more than a meal and a bit of help in the garden or chicken coop. He wasn't cruel, just quiet, like a stone in a stream, always there, never moving much. Lorna took to baking, her way of staking claim. She mixed bread with slow hands, measured sugar like it cost memory. Bea found the stable more to her liking, mucking stalls, learning the moods of the big chestnut gelding Merritt favored. They settled into the rhythm of silence and necessity. But still the question hovered like smoke. What were they to him? What did he mean for them to be? One morning Bea found a scar on Merritt's shoulder as he worked shirtless in the heat. It cut jagged across muscle, old and raised like a whip mark or blade. She didn't ask. He didn't offer. That night Lorna said, "He's not what I feared." Bea, watching the stars through the attic window, answered, "No, but he's not what we were promised either." The wind howled through the trees like it knew what was coming. And in the hush that followed, something unseen began to shift. By late September, the hills turned ochre and the sun dipped quicker behind the ridge, casting long blue shadows that crept like secrets across the prairie. The house, once hollow as a gourd, began to carry the scent of coffee and hearthwood. There was no laughter within its walls, but also no raised voices, just the soft percussion of days being lived. Lorna took to sewing in the evenings, her needle rising and falling like breath. She mended Merritt's shirts without being asked, not out of affection, but because frayed seams offended her order. She made herself useful in a quiet, pointed way, stacking jars in the pantry, wiping down the sills no one else noticed, boiling linens in a copper pot out back. Bea meanwhile made herself a place beside the horses. There was one, a skittish roan with a white blaze that no hand had broken proper. Merritt called him Smoke. Each morning before sunup, Bea stood by his stall, whispering nonsense and threading sugar cubes through the slats. By the third week, he took the bit without balking. Merritt noticed but said nothing. The unspoken bargain between them all held steady, even if its terms were fogged. Merritt left them to their own corners of the world, showing no urgency to claim what was, on paper, his, and the sisters, for their part, did not press him. They lived like tenants in a house without lease, every kindness a wary offering, every glance a question answered with silence. It was not until the first snow that the stillness cracked. They were all inside when it came, thick flakes dropping without ceremony, transforming the world in minutes. The air turned glassy and the wind howled like something hurt. Merritt came in late, drenched and stiff, his coat rimed with ice. He hung it near the stove and said, "South fence is near gone, posts rotted through." Lorna, already ladling stew, didn't ask why he hadn't mended it before now. She simply handed him a tin bowl and nodded toward the dry corner of the hearth. Bea brought in more wood without a word. That night the wind tore through the chimney like it meant to steal the fire from their bones. When the window panes began to rattle and the roof sighed under snow's weight, Merritt came upstairs and rapped once on their door. "Bundle thick," he said. "Might not be able to get more kindling till morning." His eyes lingered on the single bed, the thin quilt spread taut over both their bodies. "You need more blankets?" he asked, eyes averted. Bea said, "We've slept colder." He hesitated, then nodded once and disappeared down the stair. That was the first time either of them saw him unsure. 3 days' snow held them tight. Drifts swallowed the fence rails and no hoof left prints near the barn. They took to reading the same dog-eared book aloud, Pilgrim's Progress, its pages softened with time. Lorna read with a voice steadier than she felt, and Bea followed, sounding out the harder words. Merritt sat nearby, mending tack with his head bent, the fire casting long gold across his hands. He didn't interrupt, didn't comment. Just listened like a man thirsty for stories but too proud to ask for water. On the fourth morning, the wind eased. Merritt strapped on his boots and said, "Gotta check the line, if I'm not back by dusk." "You'll be back," Lorna interrupted, her voice a notch firmer than usual. He looked at her and something passed between them. No heat, no flirtation, just a mutual understanding of the work ahead and what it cost to keep a place like this upright. He was gone till near dark. When he returned, his lip was split and one hand wrapped in a bloodied cloth. Lorna rushed for water, Bea fetched the bottle of whiskey from the shelf, and neither asked what happened. They didn't need to. Bea poured the liquor with careful hands. "Let me," she said, as Merritt tried to swat her away. He sat on the edge of the chair and let her pull the bandage loose. The wound was deep, a gash from wrist to palm. "What did it?" Lorna asked. "Wire snapped, whipped back on me." They worked in tandem, Lorna stitching while Bea steadied the hand, her grip strong but gentle. Merritt didn't flinch. He looked away, jaw set, while they sewed him back together. When it was done, he said, "Didn't expect both of you." "Neither did we," Lorna said. That night, after the house had gone quiet, Bea lay awake, her fingers sore from bracing his weight. "He bleeds like anyone else," she whispered. Lorna turned to face her, eyes open in the dark. "He's alone like us too." They didn't speak again, but the hush between them was different now. Not the silence of strangers, but something nearer to truce. Outside, the snow softened, melting slow against the pane. Spring did not arrive so much as it crept, first in the loosening of creek ice, then in the emergence of buds like tiny fists on the cottonwoods out back. The land, weary of sleep, stirred itself awake, and with it came the tasks of revival. Merritt spoke more often now, though his voice still came quiet as dusk. He would leave notes scrawled on scrap paper, "Fence needs mending near the South Creek," or "Chick lost from brood, check behind smokehouse." Not orders, just signs he trusted they'd do what needed done. Bea, sun-browned and whipleen, had grown into the land like a wild thing. She rode Smoke bareback when Merritt wasn't watching, or maybe when he pretended not to. Her laughter, rare but real, sometimes escaped in the pasture like a bird startled from brush. Lorna, more inward, had taken over the ledger. She tracked grain, eggs, the timing of births in the goat pen. She remembered how their mother used to mark calendars in soft pencil, always hoping the world could be counted, made sense of. They began to take meals together, the three of them, plates passed hand to hand with an ease that hadn't existed before. Merritt still sat at the far end, eating slow, but now he asked about the bread or whether Bea had seen fox tracks near the fence line. It was after one of these meals that Lorna, gathering dishes, found a small carved bird left on the windowsill. Smooth and pale, whittled from pine, she didn't ask who had shaped it, though she knew it was Bea. That night she placed it on the shelf beside the bread tin, not hidden but not remarked upon either. In April, a letter came, carried by a wiry boy on a bay pony. He stayed for no more than water and the promise of a return reply. Merritt opened it alone, standing beneath the porch eave. When he returned inside, the paper was folded and dry, his expression unreadable. "Old neighbor wrote," he said, "says they're sending someone west to settle debts." Lorna felt the weight of it like a stone in her apron pocket. She didn't ask which debts. That week he began preparing the barn like a man expecting storm, repaired hinges, reinforced the stall doors. He dug deep into the far field and said little when he returned. One night, as Bea cleared away kindling, she turned to him and said, "Are we in danger?" Merritt met her gaze. "I don't know yet." She didn't press him. Neither sister had learned to beg answers from silence. They simply watched closer. The arrival came in the form of a man named Hodge, red-faced, loud-booted, and smiling like something that spoiled in heat. He rode in with two others, and a cart piled high with goods Merritt hadn't ordered. "Thought I'd pay a visit," he said, dismounting with theatrical flair. "Came to see how our old friend was managing out here. Heard tell he'd taken on help." Bea bristled. Lorna stood straighter. Merritt said only, "You're not welcome long." That night, Hodge's companions drank themselves sick in the barn. The sisters stayed close to the house, and Merritt posted himself by the door with the shotgun laid across his lap. It wasn't fear in him, more like weariness, sharpened into readiness. Come morning, Hodge cornered Lorna near the coop, his breath thick with liquor. "Heard there were two of you. Maybe he don't mind sharing." Lorna didn't flinch. "You should leave." Merritt appeared then, soundless as a shadow, and said, "Step back." Something in his voice made even the roosters fall quiet. The tension broke when Hodge, laughing, tossed up his hands and backed away. "No offense meant," he said, "just admiring." They were gone by evening, the cart kicking up a trail of dust as they disappeared east. Afterward, Merritt sat long on the porch, his face drawn. "I knew Hodge in another life," he said finally. "He held my name once, still thinks he does." Bea, arms folded, asked, "You owe him?" "I owed men worse, not anymore." Lorna joined them, pulling her shawl tighter. "What if he comes back? Then he'll find something waiting he didn't count on." No one spoke after that. The wind shifted, soft as breath. Weeks passed, and the sisters noticed Merritt watching them differently, not with hunger or need, but with a kind of quiet awe, as if the sight of them enduring was proof the world could still surprise him. One morning Bea found another carving, this time a small fox, nestled in the kitchen corner. She placed it beside the bird. Lorna said, without looking up, "You don't have to prove you're kind." "I'm not," Merritt answered from the doorway, voice low, "just trying not to be what I was." The sisters said nothing, but in the pause that followed, something rooted itself deeper. The world outside kept turning green, but inside the house something else was blooming, slow, stubborn, and tender. Summer arrived in a hush of heat. The wind lost its bite, the sky turned pewter blue, and the earth cracked beneath every step. Rain came rarely, in bursts that smelled like iron and faded too fast to matter. Work doubled under the sun's weight. Merritt hauled water from the well by lantern light, shoulders bowed like an old ox. Lorna spent her days blanching beans, salting meat, lining the cellar walls with the harvest. Bea chased down stray calves and learned to shoot over her shoulder, a skill Merritt taught her with barely a word between them. It was in these wordless moments, shared tools, past canteens, the brush of sleeves in doorways, that something fragile began to take shape. Not love, not yet, but the muscle of it forming underneath the skin of their days. Still, the past clung like smoke. In early July, a rider was spotted on the rise. Not Hodge, but another stranger, rail-thin, hat low, with a gait too deliberate to be lost. Bea saw him first. She was mucking the eastern paddock when the shape emerged from the horizon shimmer. She stepped back, whistled low, and Merritt was beside her before the echo faded. They watched together. Merritt narrowed his eyes. "Don't know him," he said. That night he laid out a rifle on the table. Not a warning, not a threat, just a precaution set plain between the coffee tin and the cracked salt jar. The man didn't come close, not that day, but they knew he might. And so their routines tightened like thread around a button, doors latched earlier, lanterns burned longer, sleep grew light. One evening, as they shelled peas under the porch eaves, Bea asked Merritt, "Would you send us away if trouble came?" He didn't answer right off. The wind curled beneath the boards. "No," he said finally, "not again." Neither sister asked what again meant, but Lorna watched him closely after that, her needle pausing more often, her gaze lingering on the hollow just above his collarbone, where a scar, old and pale, curved like a broken wish. The heat thickened. One morning a coyote was found gutted near the coop, chickens scattered and one hen missing. Merritt knelt by the carcass, his jaw tight. "Wasn't hunger," he muttered. "This was sport." He stood, wiping his hands on his trousers, and added, "Men did this." That night Bea couldn't sleep. She sat on the porch steps, boots unlaced, watching moths dance around the lamp glass. Merritt came out after a while, settling beside her with a tin cup in hand. "You ever been hunted?" she asked, not looking at him. He took a sip, eyes on the horizon. "Once." "Why?" "Because I stopped being what they paid me to be." She nodded, slow. "You ever kill a man?" "Yes." They sat with that. It didn't feel like confession. It felt like weather, something old, inevitable, and not theirs to change. Lorna found them that way, silent side by side in the low light. She didn't ask what passed between them. But the next morning she laid a clean shirt on Merritt's bed, hem stitched tighter, seams reinforced. And when he came down for breakfast, he said her name aloud for the first time. "Thank you, Lorna." She turned away before he saw the tear slip free. The stranger returned the next day. This time he rode up bold, tipped his hat, and asked for water. Merritt stood in the doorway with the shotgun loose in his grip. "State your business." The man smiled with too many teeth. "Just passing through. Heard tell a man named Calder kept good horses and better women." Bea stepped out from behind the door. Merritt didn't move. "Keep riding." The man's smile faded. "Shame. Looks like you've got more than you can handle here." Merritt raised the shotgun a fraction. That wasn't a request. The man spit in the dust and rode on. They watched until he was a dot in the shimmering distance. Inside, the air felt thinner. Lorna pressed her hands against the sink to steady herself. Later, after supper, Merritt spoke to them in the kitchen. "I know you came here because you had to, because someone sold you." Neither sister interrupted. His voice, low and raw, carried all the weight it needed. "I didn't ask for you, but I've come to count on you more than I ever meant to. This land, this place. It's only stood because you've stood in it." Bea tilted her head. "You saying you want us to stay?" "I'm saying I'd be less than a man if I let you leave now." Lorna crossed her arms, the flicker of a smile ghosting her lips. "You think we're waiting for permission?" He looked at her, something soft breaking loose in his expression. "No," he said, "I think you've stayed in spite of it." That night there was no thunder, no storm, but the air smelled of change. And deep in the night Bea rose, walked to the barn, and let smoke run free into the dark, her silhouette still as stone beneath the stars. By mid-August, the sky turned bronze each evening, and the air held a dryness that made the lungs ache. The cottonwoods rattled like bones. Coyotes called from the hills but didn't come close. Something had shifted, not just in the weather, but in the way the house stood on the land, as if it had grown teeth. The sisters woke each morning with the quiet certainty that no one was coming to save them, but also with the steadier truth that no one could take what they weren't willing to give. They learned this the hard way, and it had sunk into their marrow like salt in old wood. Merritt grew leaner, his face worn at the edges, but he carried himself taller. He let Lorna take over his bookkeeping, gave Bea reign over the western fence line, and neither felt like charity. It felt like trust, hard-earned and paid for in blistered hands and long silences. The carved figures, now a fox, a bird, and a badger, lined the shelf above the stove. Lorna dusted them each week without fail. No one mentioned them aloud. Then one dusk, as they finished their meal, Smoke returned. He came out of the fading light alone, ribs heaving, a scratch along his flank bleeding slow and steady. Bea dropped her spoon and was out the door before either of the others stood. She pressed her forehead to his as she led him into the barn, her breath catching. "Who rode you?" she whispered. "Who?" The gelding flinched when she touched the saddle marks. Merritt arrived a beat later and said nothing, just examined the tracks in the dirt with his mouth set grim. The next morning, Bea found a note pinned to the barn door. "We always collect. The sisters were just payment. H." Merritt burned the note without a word. But by afternoon, he was packing saddle bags with cartridges, salt, and dried meat. "I'll ride west, find where they're posted, cut it off at the root." Lorna, who had not cried in months, gripped the edge of the table. "You think we'll still be here when you come back?" "I think if I don't go, none of us will." Bea stepped forward. "Then we ride with you." He looked at her long, eyes dark. "You stay." "No," she said. "You made a home of us. We'll defend it same as you." The standoff held until Lorna stepped between them. "If we're to be taken again, it won't be with our backs turned." Merritt cursed under his breath, but when he saddled up, he readied 3 horses. They rode at dawn. The prairie stretched wide and unforgiving, and for 2 days they moved without incident, sleeping beside low fires, one always awake. On the 3rd, they found signs, hoofprints, bits of charred bone, a woman's shawl snagged on barbed wire. Bea dismounted and picked it loose. The cloth trembled in her grip. They reached the old trading post by evening. Half-rotted and sun-bleached, the timbers leaned like drunkards, and there, in the hollow between collapsed walls, stood Hodge. He was alone at first glance, arms folded, smile flat. "Took you long enough." But behind the post loitered 2 others, rifles in hand, faces hard. Merritt stepped forward, every inch a man who had survived more than he'd ever told. "You come after what's mine again, I bury you where you stand." Hodge chuckled. "They ain't yours, Calder. They were bought with debt, just property. I've got the note." "You had the note," Merritt said. "It burned." At that, Hodge moved, slow, deliberate, toward Lorna. "She yours too." Before Merritt could answer, a shot rang out. Bea stood behind the stock of her rifle, smoke curling skyward. The bullet buried itself in the dirt 2 inches from Hodge's boot. She didn't flinch. Take one more step and the next won't miss. The silence that followed felt long enough to age. Then Hodge raised both hands. "You made your choice." Merritt nodded. "We made ours." They left the bodies behind them, alive but stripped of power, and rode home in silence. When they returned, the house looked unchanged, but the land felt new. Claimed, not in ink or law, but by the sheer force of their staying. That night, Merritt stood on the porch with the sisters beside him. He reached into his pocket and held out 2 rings, simple bands of smoothed brass. "Didn't make these for ownership," he said. "Made them for witness." Lorna's hands trembled when she took hers. Bea didn't speak, just slid hers on with steady fingers. They stood there until the stars showed, 3 figures beneath the porch light, the weight of their past behind them, the shape of a future not yet spoken but already forming. The rains came late that year, not in storm or roar but soft and steady, like someone asking forgiveness. The earth drank it slow, grateful, and the dust that had clung to everything, windowsills, boots, throats, lifted at last. The land healed as quietly as the people who lived on it. In the months after Hodge's retreat, the rhythm of the homestead deepened into something nearly sacred. Not peace in the storybook sense, but a kind of earned quiet, where each day layered over the last like bark on a growing tree, stronger for the wounds, not in spite of them. Merritt rose early, as always, but now the coffee was hot by the time he reached the table, and 2 bowls waited beside his. Bea took the east fields as her own, breaking the soil with the strength of someone who no longer needed to prove anything. Lorna spent her afternoons by the window, stitching long seams with her hair unbound, humming a song neither sister recognized but knew all the same. The brass rings stayed on their hands through chores, through meals, through storms, not wedding bands, not exactly. No preacher had spoken over them. But they were promises just the same, worn and visible. Not a claim, but a vow made and kept with each small kindness, each look held just a second longer than it used to be. Merritt slept in the same room still, but sometimes, after the lanterns were blown out, footsteps could be heard, soft, deliberate, crossing to the attic stairs. And though no one ever spoke of it in daylight, some mornings found Bea or Lorna already sitting at the stove, coffee poured for 3. In late October, a wagon approached from the south. This time it carried no threat, only a woman with 2 sons and eyes too tired to ask for help outright. She said her man had died crossing the Brazos, and the church in Ellery had turned them away. Lorna brought them in without asking. They stayed through the cold spell, then longer, the boys learning to fish from Bea and stack kindling beside Merritt without being told. The woman Alice took over the smokehouse with grateful hands. She never pried. She simply stayed, and the house expanded to make room. That was how it began, not with declarations or contracts, but by saying yes when someone needed a place to land. Come winter, a child was born to Alice in the back room, with Lorna guiding the birth and Bea boiling water and Merritt holding the door tight against the wind. The baby came small but loud, a girl. They named her Junia, after the preacher's wife, who'd once slipped the sisters bread during their hungriest week in Abilene. The carved shelf grew, too. A bear joined the fox, the bird, the badger. Then a squirrel, shaped by Alice's older son, who shyly placed it there without being told. The house began to breathe like something living. One evening, as frost crept up the panes, Merritt stood beside Bea at the barn, watching the last colt of the season take cautious steps. He said, "You saved me." She didn't look at him. We saved each other. He nodded once. That was enough. In the kitchen, Lorna sat with Junia swaddled in her arms, her needle still for once. She looked toward the window, where the stars burned like distant candles, and smiled. She didn't think of what had been lost to bring them here, not often. The world had taken much. But in its taking, it had forced them into each other's arms, into the kind of life not born from ease, but from endurance. They had not been asked for. They had been sold like goods in a ledger. But they had carved something holy from the asking. And in the silence that wrapped the house each night, broken only by breath, the shuffle of boots, the creak of floorboards, there was love, not spoken, not demanded, but present and permanent, like roots beneath prairie grass, like rain returned to thirsty land, like home built not from timber but from choice, every day again, every hour still.